What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Pioneer video, and we're going to be doing something new on the channel that we have not really done before, and that is putting the Pioneer decks into a tier list and, obviously giving my thoughts and opinions why I have decks ranked where they are. I think this is going to be kind of a good benchmark to kind of study decks going forward once we kind of get Bloomborough coming out, and this will be a nice way to kind of wrap up the RCQ season as we have like just about, I think, 1 or 2 weekends left by the time this video comes out. So don't be offended if I don't have your deck ranked nearly as high. Again, I'm going to be giving some of my thoughts and opinions. I, of course, am human. I make errors. I can be wrong about things, but we can always have that discussion and stuff in the comments down below, which I've prided myself on, like having that open dialogue and stuff on my channel and on my videos and whatnot for people to kind of voice their opinions. Of course, before we get too deep into the video and we kind of like start ranking these Pioneer decks and whatnot, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me where I do a lot of content based on the Pioneer and Modern format along with some other longer form videos, then I would greatly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button and ring notification bell so you know when those future videos get posted. And it's a free, easy way to support me and my content as we are on the road to a 1K subscribers. We are absolutely torching it, but the year is going by pretty quick. So, if you want to be a part of it and whatnot, please do so. I'm going to be looking to doing some special things if we hit 1,000 subscribers pretty early into the year. So, just keep pounding away. We're going to keep putting out videos. We're going to keep doing our very best to, keep y'all entertained. But with that said, let's go ahead, take a look at our tier list and start ranking these decks. So here we have our tier list. We have a ton of decks we're going to look at. I believe it was like 13 or 14 different decks that we're going to take a look. Of course, this isn't the entirety 100% of the Pioneer metagame, but this is definitely a lot of the decks that you are going to run into that people have had, results with, whether it's a lot or a little. And I think the most likely decks that you would take to a tournament if you were actually trying to win and take it down outside of maybe like your own brew or whatever for like your store's metagame and stuff. So kind of as we go through, I will kind of talk about the tiers and everything like that and why I have them, decks in where they are and why, they are ranked as high or as low as they are. So S tier, this is the absolute best of the best. I think this is, if you were, starting from scratch, you don't know anything about the format and you wanted to play a deck that you could have a lot of success with in the format and going to reward you for knowing a lot. Of course, having a very, very powerful, plan A, and where plan B can even be as good of an option as a lot of other decks like plan A, what they have going on. And I think unequivocally that this tier belongs to these 3 decks here. So we have Izzet Phoenix, we have Amalia combo, and then we have the Rakdos Vampires deck. I'd probably rank them like this. I think Amalia is probably the best deck in the format, and we'll kind of go through each one. So we'll talk about Amalia first, and I'll hopefully throw up a deck list here on the screen for each of the decks that we're kind of looking at here. So Amalia is like the de facto like creature combo deck of the format. I mean, I would say that it's like the only creature combo deck, but some of the other ones that play a little bit more aggressive just kind of get blanked by the fact that Amalia can just blow up the board once you kind of enact your combo. It has a ton of redundancy in things like Court of Calling, Collected Company, Return to the Ranks. Eventually, when Bloomborough comes out, it's like do drop something or whatever. Let you get back 2 2-cost things, or if you give your opponent a card, 3. And, we know Amalia is essentially a 2 to 3 card like combo where, it plus a Wild Growth Walker and a way to gain life. So with just even that, you give your opponent a card and you're able to assemble your combo and find a way to win. Kind of as the deck has existed, we knew that the deck was going to be kind of a big deal at the regional championship at the end of 2023. And it was definitely an unrefined list. It was all focused going all in on just attacking with Amalia and winning the game. But kind of as the format has evolved, we've added like Aetherflux Reservoir. And instead of playing 4 Return to the Ranks, some lists play 1 to 2. You have Dina in there as like a way if your opponent tries to, draw the game, or if you try to draw the game and whatnot, you're able to actually drain your opponent completely out of life or sacrifice one of your pieces if need be to kind of, again, stop your opponent from drawing the game or stop you from drawing the game, what have you. It's very powerful, very consistent, again, with like kind of all the redundancies. Even like a card like Lively Dirge in the deck where for 5 mana you can put a card from your deck into your graveyard and then return up to 4 mana value worth of creatures, or return up to 2 creatures with total mana value 4. It's not up to 4 mana value. But like in that way, you can then just kind of get back your full combo for 4 mana, 5 if you need to go search for a piece and whatnot. Just the amount of redundancy and how powerful the deck is. Of course, just, when it combos, it doesn't necessarily win the game on the spot. It can, and it can do it as early as turn 3. But even on like turn 4, very consistently, as long as you kind of enact your combo and whatnot, and you're able to kind of go through with it, is a very low fail rate in kind of my experience. And it has a pretty good matchup against the other two decks, which feels weird to say because it is a creature combo deck, and these two decks primarily play a decent amount of removal. We see things like Bitter Triumph and Fatal Push and something like that from the Rakdos Vampires deck. We see like Fiery Impulse and like Cosmic Tower or something like that, and then like Lightning Axe from the Phoenix decks. But oddly enough, like, it kind of doesn't matter. If they get to do their thing and we get to do our thing and they don't really interact, well then Amalia has a very good shot at taking Phoenix out of the game completely, and then putting Rakdos Vampires kind of on the back foot and making it very hard for them to try to win the game, because again, you're just going to top an Aether Flux Reservoir, and they have to deal with your 20 power Amalia that's going to one-shot them, and then also deal with your 50 damage Fireball that's going to be coming off the top for 4 mana. On top of that as well, there's not really a good way of getting rid of this card. Even then, like, if you just get a Return to the Ranks, you can just put everything back into play and then go until you find your Aether Flux Reservoir and whatnot and call it a day, and it'll be GG's. So that's kind of where I put Amalia as like the best deck in the format. Obviously, it does have a little bit of a fail rate. Depending on how you want to build the deck, if you play a little bit more mid-range, then you're a little less focused on the combo, but you're going to be a lot grindier. If you're kind of all in on the creatures, then you're, if you can't find an Amalia, or you can't find a Wild Growth Walker or whatnot, even with all the redundancy, it does happen. I've played Yawgmoth a ton of times, and there's been plenty of games where I'm like, man, I really wish I draw Yawgmoth because then I can just win the game, but then you don't, and you're kind of stuck playing this like mopey-ish like kind of creature beatdown, which I think in this format is a little bit harder to do, again, with kind of the removal that these two decks have. But yeah, I have Amalia as like the number 1 best deck in the format. Number 2, I have Rakdos Vampires, and that's just because this floor on this deck is like so high. I think that there's a lot of busted things you can do in this deck. Of course, you have the Fable, the Mirror Breakers, where if you get 2 of them flipped, you can just make a ton of Fables on your opponent's end step, untap, and then make a ton of like Vein Rippers, and then just if the attack does not kill your opponent, a creature dying more than likely will. So you just like make a ton of Vein Rippers, Fatal Push like one of their like 1 or 2 drops, and then like boom, they're just dead. On top of that too, just making a bunch of 2/2s as well and getting to attack with a bunch of them each turn, also pretty good. Just getting to play like this grindy mid-range game plan, but then you also have this button that you can hit where you just end up being super aggressive, where you put a lot of pressure on Amalia, you put a lot of pressure on the Phoenix decks, you don't let them get set up and whatnot to, again, eventually combo if you're Amalia, or get a ton of Phoenixes back / set up like one of the new cards and Eidetic Memory for some of your bigger threats and whatnot. I think it definitely is like in between, handling both decks very well. Of course, with a lot of mid-range decks, you have the tendency to kind of flood, and I think that's the only like crack in the armor for the Rakdos Vampires deck, is that if you don't have a Fable and you just have like a heavy land draw, and you don't have Sorin plus Vein Ripper, which is a lot of things to go wrong for this deck for it to like look pretty bad. But aside from that, again, just like at the floor, just being a super grindy like Rakdos mid-range deck and having this kind of aggressive option that you can play for decks that kind of want to sit around and durdle, while also being able to grind with like 99% of the mid-range decks in the format, I think puts, for me at least, the Rakdos Vampires deck solidly as like the second best deck in the format. Izzet Phoenix is very explosive. Obviously, winning the game on turn 3 is probably about as explosive as you can get. So it's kind of like a little less explosive than Amalia. And with Eidetic Memory, I think it does make it very grindy. It's kind of like in between Amalia and Rakdos Vampires. I think Rakdos definitely does the grindy thing very well because that's just kind of how the deck's made, but it can be very aggressive. And Amalia, it doesn't necessarily want to do the mid-range thing, but it can do it. It does have like kind of that resiliency and whatnot, but it does have like a lot of redundancy and is able to combo very quickly. And I think Arclight Phoenix, you're going to have some draws where you hit 2 or 3 Phoenixes on like the first few turns, and then all of a sudden like you're bringing back like 3 Arclight Phoenixes on like turn 3 or turn 4, and that's hard for a lot of decks to end up actually getting to deal with, on top of the fact that while you're doing this, you're playing cantrips, so you're drawing cards effectively, which means for like the new card, Prof's Eidetic Memory, which is going to put counters on your creature based on how many cards you drew -1, in combination with getting to play the best draw spell in the format in Treasure Cruise. This deck gets to play a lot of powerful spells. It gets to get to the board very quickly, and thanks to Profs, it makes all of your creatures threats, where Ledger Shredder was kind of a slow burn where you get to 2, 3, 4 power. Ideally, like every other turn, well, every turn, but ideally, and realistically, usually every other turn, it was going to end up getting a counter on it. Discourage your opponent from double spelling, which is very hard to get back in the game when your opponent's trying to play 1 spell a turn, and you're able to play 2, 3, 4, 5 spells a turn thanks to all the draw power and stuff that the deck has, and being able to interact with your opponent's board as well. Profs is not to be underestimated, because I've played a ton of games where my opponent's not like playing damage-based removal like in the mirrors, and if you just get like a Picklock Prankster with like 3 or 4 counters on it, I mean, ends up being a 5/7. I mean, it even checks, the Vein Rippers and stuff from the Rakdos Vampires deck and whatnot. Of course, they have Fatal Pushes, Bitter Triumphs, whatnot. If you're able to kind of like protect your creatures like Spell Pierce and stuff like that, you can kind of overwhelm the Vampires deck in the air if they're not able to have like their fast start plus interact with the board. And same thing with Amalia. If Amalia is kind of dirtling around where it doesn't have like a fast combo setup, or really just a lot of creatures backed up by a decent amount of life gain, then you can kind of overpower both decks. I just think on a consistency basis, you're relying a lot on getting more Phoenixes back and really trying to play a ton of cantrips. Like you're looking for Profs, or you're looking for a ton of Phoenixes and whatnot, or just trying to get multiple Ledger Shredders going. And while all those are very powerful, I just think that having essentially an I win button in both of these decks, and just absolutely grinding your opponent into paste if you're the Rakdos deck, or just going for a fast combo, or even just kind of building more towards like a mid-rangey type of like creature combo deck, is a little bit better than what Phoenix has going on. That said, I'm willing to hear an argument for any one of these 3 decks kind of, swapping places, whether you think Phoenix is better or Rakdos is better over the Amalia deck and whatnot. I just think in my kind of personal experience in experiencing the format and whatnot, I think that Amalia is probably best suited to be like the best deck in the format, and these 2 are just second and third. But again, I'm kind of willing to hear any arguments for why one deck should be over the other one and whatnot. So that's our S tier. That's basically the best decks in the format. A tier are decks that I think are pretty good against the top decks of the format, whether one deck or multiples of the deck. Remember, like these decks have like a 10% ownership of like the Pioneer metagame. So I mean, having a deck that's pretty good against like 20-30% of the meta, where you're expecting multiple decks at a tournament to be present, is very good. And then I think overall it's just doing something very powerful, where it also beats up on some of the other lower tier decks in the format, and then also has some game against the top tier decks in the format. And I have 2 decks in particular that I really like in kind of like this tier 1.5, where you could argue that they belong in S tier, maybe towards like the bottom, but they're kind of like riding high of like solidly good decks that you can play, that I think can challenge a lot of what these decks have going on. That's the Mono Green Devotion deck and the Niv Delight deck. So Mono Green Devotion is kind of in this combo position now that Karn the Great Creator was banned back at the end of 2023, and definitely kind of goes back to its roots of being a green devotion deck that is doing some very powerful things, rather than kind of being this combo deck where it has like a plan of just going big and wide on, and then having like this, oh, hey, here's Karn, like I'm going to win the game sort of thing. And now this deck gets to essentially win the game on the spot thanks to Uvenwald Oddity, where you can end up flipping it, give your creatures +1/+1, haste, and I believe trample. So you're able to like fill your board with a ton of, these big like 5 mana 5/6s, 3 mana 4/4s, 3 mana 4/5s, and whatnot. and then just, increase your power toughness by 1, get to attack with them that turn. While Oddity is pretty big on its own. Flipping for 7 mana is like nothing in this deck that can make, 10 to 12 mana, and thanks to stuff like Kiora, can untap your Nykthos and generate even more mana. Of course, the Storm the Festival is still one of the best cards that you can play, and the fact that you can kind of mill a Storm the Festival thanks to the Cavalier of Thorns, and then flash it back for a ton of, for like 10 mana later, but like, really, it doesn't even matter because, you're going to make a ton of mana with Nykthos. Outland Caster, or whatever the heck it is, the 4 mana, like the 3 mana 4/2 that draws a card whenever a creature power 4 or greater enters the battlefield, and it can even make mana, you can plot it and whatnot. It does a lot for the deck, and the fact that you can like plot it on turn 2, and then you can end up playing it, and then like on turn 3 playing like another 4 power thing and getting to draw cards and whatnot. You just end up creating a ton of value kind of in that way, where you're just able to put a lot of pressure on the board, and with kind of having the Outrider or whatnot. But of course, like that's the one card name that I can't remember. The Outcaster Trailblazer. You can have multiple copies of essentially Kiora static ability, drawing a ton of cards and kind of keeping your chain going, where, if you have a Nykthos in play already, you end up making like a ton of mana. Well, boom, you play another Nykthos, you essentially reset all that mana, and then kind of get to keep going and whatnot, and keep chaining with like Cavalier Thorns, getting to draw cards, potentially find other Nykthoses, and Storm the Festivals, getting to do the same thing until you play Nuvenwald Oddity and flip it. I think it's very powerful. I think it borders on, I think you could almost consider it as like the 4th deck. I think like towards like the bottom, maybe even a little bit better than Phoenix, but I just think that with what it's doing, it is very powerful. I think it while it's not, I think, as fast as like Amalia in some of its theoretical draws and whatnot, and like with the Rakdos Vampires deck, I think can kind of disrupt it. Phoenix, I think, is the only one that might struggle with it a little bit. Same thing with like Nimizit, but just the fact that Phoenix has so many like powerful draws too, that sometimes the Devotion deck really can't keep up unless it has some of its more busted draws, where I think if it does, it kind of checks Phoenix and a lot of these other decks very nicely. So I have it probably better than Niv Mizzet, like in the A tier, but I also think Niv Mizzet is also a very powerful deck as well. So it's, to me, probably the best mid-range deck, and you're probably wondering, like, Dakota, if you think it's the best mid-range deck, why is it in A tier right behind the, Mono Green Devotion deck, instead of being in the S tier above, like, something like Rakdos Phoenix, or Rakdos Vampires? And the reason being is the fact that the deck is pretty slow. It does have a lot of tools to, like things like Lightning Helix, Deafening Clarion, stuff like that, to kind of disrupt your opponent. It has a lot of tools going on for it. But it's a deck that if you were kind of like playing a tap land every turn and whatnot, and eventually you get to like turn 4, play like an Omnath or whatever, like a lot of these decks on turn 4, Amalia on turn 4 has a very good chance of just comboing off and winning the game. Is it Phoenix has a good chance on turn 4 to have just an insane amount of power into play, and then like even if you're like the Niv Mizzet Reborn deck and then you play Niv Mizzet or whatever like on turn 4 or turn 5, like there's going to be a lot of times where against Phoenix, it's probably not going to be good enough. It's not going to be able to check like the Ledger Shredders and whatnot. It's sure, like it could end up theoretically getting a Vein Ripper, but Vein Ripper can also just kind of outgrow itself thanks to, Sorin. On top of this, kind of being vulnerable to removal, and of course, like a well-timed Thoughtseize as well can kind of stop like the chains of like Bring to Light and whatnot. But when other decks kind of like stumble, and like maybe the other mid-range decks kind of like miss their land drops, you hit a few key pieces in like the Amalia deck, you stop like a Ledger Shredder from like sticking onto the battlefield from the Phoenix deck, then I think Niv Mizzet can slowly start to take over a game. I think the fact that it kind of has like these reset buttons that it can go get with something like Bring to Light, and you're able to play some more silver bullets thanks to Bring to Light, on top of just getting to, have certain draws where you're going to be able to play a Bring to Light as early as like turn 4, and then go and get a thing that's going to help the situation, where if you're playing against an aggro deck, you just end up going and getting like a board wipe, kind of resetting things. And then from there, like all of your spells are just essentially going to be haymakers against the deck that is trying to rebuild. And if your opponent overextends, that's just even more punishing as well. Or just going and getting like a key removal spell, like something like Valky to then go cast the backside of like Tibble, going and getting things like Deafening Clarion, again, to like kind of clear up small creatures, going and getting like Unmoored Ego to hit, your opponent's Amalias and whatnot, or even like Arclight Phoenixes and things like that. So it definitely has like the tools. It kind of plays like Mono Green Devotion like pre-ban, except that it has to like play those cards in the main deck, but it definitely has the tools to kind of use them over and over again, or at least like a few times. And again, like in just some of these like classic kind of like mid-range where we're kind of dirtling and stuff, it's definitely going to dirtle like the best of them and put tons of pressure into play, with a 5-mana 6/6 flyer and a lot of its other disruption pieces in the deck. So I have these decks in the A tier, kind of in that bordering on being in S tier. Solidly out of tier 2, but I don't think they're necessarily tier 1. Again, they do things that are very powerful, and if you kind of let them do their thing unchecked, arguably they're kind of better than what these decks have going on. Certainly, Mono Green and Niv-Mizzet Reborn unchecked kind of do things better than Rakdos Vampires, but Rakdos Vampires are so good at disrupting it that if you hit some key pieces in either deck, it ends up being a relatively fair fight, if not more so in Rakdos Vampires like favor. But I think these decks definitely can challenge some of these other top decks, especially if you're just kind of like struggling, or maybe you're not hitting the right things if you're Amalia, Vampires, or Phoenix. And if these decks are kind of firing all cylinders, they get the ball rolling, they're very hard to stop. So that's kind of like my A tier. That's my, kind of borders on being, in the tier 1. I think you could have more than 3 decks like in tier 1, if you really want to. But I think for just kind of making it harder, or just kind of finding a reason to kind of shave down some of the top tiers and whatnot, and kind of make it a little bit more exclusive. These are I would say like the 5 best decks in the format. I think that they're doing something very powerful that regardless of what anyone else is doing, I think they are a little bit harder to interact with. They're a little bit definitely like once they get going and whatnot, they're very hard to stop. So that's kind of, where we're at here, where like our tier 1 to tier 1.5 are these 5 decks here. So B tier, like this tier 2, I think are decks that are powerful. I think that most people are not going to be super familiar with them. Like I think at the RCQ level, depending on like kind of the store that you frequent or not, I would say like probably like 80 to 90% of stores. I think if you play a deck like this, some players just are going to like, oh, hey, like they're playing this deck, but I don't think they're going to know really, some of the more intricate things that you can do. And you can kind of get some free wins by playing decks like these, especially if your opponent stumbles, doesn't interact or whatnot, kind of like the Dream where you just get to kind of do your thing. That I think it's a lot harder. Or, that if you just have a lot of time and practice in with playing these decks, I think that they're going to be some very solid picks. And as I've always said on my channel, instead of playing something like an Amalia, Rakdos Vampires, or Arclight Phoenix, when you have essentially little to no practice with them, just kind of an idea of what they want to do, versus playing something like one of the other decks that we're going to kind of go over, I would kind of lean towards playing a B tier deck, or like a tier 2 deck that I have a lot of reps in with and that I have a lot of familiarity with in the format proper, rather than just picking up the best deck or what I perceive as the best deck and then just trying to kind of play it, for a few days and take it to a tournament that matters. So kind of here I have the blue-white control and like the Rakdos midrange of the format. So Rakdos midrange is different from the Rakdos Vampires. I think a lot of what the Rakdos midrange deck is doing nowadays is, just being more of a mid-range deck, definitely playing more red, being grindier and whatnot. Probably somewhere in between like the Vampires deck and the Niv-Mizzet deck. I would say that this is probably maybe just a hair grindier than the Rakdos Vampires decks. I have not like really played just straight mid-range versus the Vampires matchup. But I definitely think you lean a little bit more into red as like the Rakdos mid-range deck. You're able to play some different spells or whatnot rather than trying to kind of fit like this package of like a Planeswalker plus Giant Vampire in your deck. So maybe a little bit more comfortable for some of the other players, but Rakdos mid-range is just a lot better if you're going to play a Rakdos mid-range-esque deck in the format. Blue-white control, what can I say? Blue-white controls like always existed in Magic for years, and I think here it's still kind of a solid deck. I don't know if I would necessarily put it here. We can kind of mess around with where we rank them. I think at this point, like tier 2 doesn't really matter all that much. But I think that, Blue-White Control, Rakdos, Midrange, they're kind of the stock decks of the format pre-Pro Tour Murders of Karlov banner, where like these are the decks that were, the second and third most played decks in the format, and they performed poorly, and I think that's because there's just, better things to be doing other than control, even if you're playing in a field that has essentially open deck lists. And Rakdos mid-range as well. Just if either of these decks stumble, you just end up getting too far behind too quickly with how fast some of these other decks can play in the format. And like, yeah, they have some catch-up stuff that they can do to, stop your opponent and whatnot. But even when they kind of like do their thing, they're not closing out the game very quickly, giving your opponent a chance to kind of play around some of their counter spells, play around some of your removal and whatnot, and just kind of go and do their thing anyway through kind of what you have going on. Of course, I think if you're like a really good control player, a really good Rakdos mid-range player, you can kind of avoid some of those situations, and you can kind of identify when to be a little bit more aggressive or to kind of like hold back and be more passive. But I think like that skill ceiling is a lot higher, and if you're not really familiar with playing either of these decks, and you want to go and like win a tournament, I would avoid playing these decks. Going a little bit further, two different decks that I have here are the mono black discard deck and the Boros Convoke deck. So this deck, the mono black discard deck, is a deck that you essentially want to draw like certain parts of it at certain stages. At the beginning, you definitely want a hand that's probably a little bit more discard heavy to kind of run your opponent out of resources, end up having them discard the spells you can't really deal with, like leaving them the creatures that you're able to use your removal spells on, and then slamming a threat into play that is going to end up closing out the game by the time your opponent's able to really draw out of it. Thanks to like Waste Not and whatnot, you're able to kind of play a little bit of a curve where you can like Thoughtseize your opponent on one, maybe take their one drop. They play their land, they don't do anything, of course, because you took their only play. You play a Waste Not on turn 2, then they play like their creature or whatever that you don't really care about, and then you can go blank them where they discard 2 cards. You get some value off of your Waste Not, and then potentially if they discard lands, you can have removal spells for like their 2-drop. You can end up making zombies, drawing cards, whatnot, and kind of keep things going that way. I think that it's definitely a deck where if you draw the wrong half of it, where if you draw like a threat heavy hand, you don't end up really doing the thing that you necessarily want to do. And while playing a lot of discard spells is very good in the format, I would say, a lot of the times too, you're going to get to like those late games where if you get into like this top deck war with your opponent, chances are they're going to be playing all the spells that they can play. They're not really going to be holding anything back unless it's obviously removal and whatnot for one of your other threats. And then like your future Thoughtseizes, Duresses, Go Blanks, and things like that are going to be mostly dead. Go Blank has a little bit of versatility where they can obviously exile the graveyard, which can be good in a lot of, in some of these matchups here. That's going to be pretty good getting rid of the graveyard. But by and large, I think if you run pretty hot with the deck and you draw the right part of it, you could probably push it into this A tier. So maybe it's a little bit more so like here, probably ahead of like Blue-White Control. But if you draw like the wrong half of it, it's going to feel pretty bad. And if you end up drawing future discard spells later, it's going to feel pretty awful. The Convoke deck is a lot worse because a lot of these decks, this deck is definitely more susceptible to removal than some of the other kind of like creature decks that are trying to beat down the format. You can put 14 power into play in turn 2 with this deck, and just like a lot of some of these other decks, if your opponent stumbles when you're putting 14 power into play, or they're able to only really remove one thing at a time, you're able to absolutely beat down and just push through tons of damage to your opponent and makes life very difficult for them if you're playing this playing the Boros Convoke deck. And it's a tad resilient as well. You can survive kind of like a board wipe, maybe a second one, depending on how your draw lines up. But it definitely, every iteration past kind of the first time you do it, does get a little bit weaker. Obviously, there's, again, some pretty powerful draws, especially when you go like Venerated Loxodon to have 14 power into play, and then you follow it up with like an Imidane's Recruiter. You have 6-7 creatures that are going to get buffed, plus getting to hit with a lot of them. I mean, it's just it's a deck that, again, if your opponent's not necessarily prepared for it, or if they stumble or whatnot, or maybe they kill the wrong creature, or they decide like, well, maybe I have a turn where I can wait or whatnot, and you just floop ton of power into play. It's going to be very hard for them to win. Again, that said, if your opponent has, some well-timed removal spells, or, plays something like Supreme Verdict, or even like Anger of the Gods, Deafening Clarion, or whatnot, you can kind of keep them off of, playing some of their other big things. And, basically, essentially their payoffs in the, like, Night Air and Evios and the Venerated Loxodon and whatnot. Of course, I kind of give it the, a big nod here because, again, it's just a ton of power into play. It's very aggressive. Even the draws where it doesn't have that, I mean, you have, like, Warden of the Inner Sky, I believe is the name of the card, that can also generate some value as well to kind of get it going and then be a threat that you can just hit in the air and kind of smooth out your draws a little bit with the scrying and whatnot. Lastly, I'm going to put Quintorius Combo here. I was going to put it in C tier, but I think it kind of belongs here. It's a deck that does interact very well. It has plenty of different things. It's essentially the Cascade deck of the format. And it kind of falls in the same category of when it kind of stumbles, it feels bad. And when it does its thing, it's very powerful and is bordering on, game ending. In a lot of cases, like Amalia, I don't think there's enough life that you can, enough damage you can deal with the deck where if Amalia gets to kind of do the thing that you can necessarily win with that. Of course, you're going to have a ton of Quintoriuses into play and can make some spirits and whatnot. But, overall, I think that the Quintorius deck, once it kind of goes off, more than likely in a lot of cases wins the game. There's not really much removal, if any, in the Is It Phoenix deck that can deal with Planeswalkers. There's like 1 or 2 copies of like Bitter Triumph in the Rakdos deck that can deal with like a Quintorius once you kind of go off, and a lot of these other decks, like sure, Lightning Helix can deal with like a Quintorius and whatnot, but the mono green decks don't really have any instant speed ways of like dealing with it. So really, like once Quintorius hits the battlefield, even if your opponent has mana up, unless it's like a counter spell or some other like hard removal spell, which a few of these decks at the top are actually playing, then Quintorius can kind of get to do its thing, go unchecked, and then just absolutely like win the game on the spot. Of course, getting to play things like Leyline Binding and play like Trumpeting Carnosaur, which is like another way, I guess, that it could win the game. And of course, Discover into Quintorius that can go into then your clones and stuff and make copies of your creature and whatnot. Again, just there's times where it's going to feel mopey. You're not going to really be able to cast some of your removal spells, or you're only going to really draw like your removal spells and whatnot. You're going to miss land drops and whatnot. And it's going to feel pretty bad. There is a decent amount of cards that help you find extra lands so that you can kind of smooth out your draw, find the colors you need or the basic land types that you need to make Leyline Bindings cost 1 mana. But, there's going to be times where it feels awful and you're going to wonder why you're playing the deck. And with the misery that Randy, my co-host on the Casual Spikes podcast, played the deck and just said it was a miserable experience playing with it. I've had a lot of fun playing it, but I definitely think it's kind of like a solid tier 2 deck to play, where it definitely is kind of the poster child of, my opponent doesn't exactly know what's going on in this deck, then I can, kind of combo off and get some wins that way. But even if they have an idea of what's going on, my advanced knowledge of kind of how these matchups and stuff play out can kind of, again, put some percentage points in my favor to actually like end up winning the game. So that's going to be like my tier 2 for this set of decks and whatnot. I think very powerful. Definitely you get some percentage points for knowing what's going on and understanding the format, while also having an even deeper understanding of what your deck does in certain matchups. But they definitely have a little bit higher of a fail rate, I would say, than some of these other decks. And kind of when they fail, like even these top decks, when they fail at doing kind of like plan A, plan B is still pretty solid, where I think plan B for a lot of these decks is just kind of like meh and mopey, where, A is really good, but then B just is leagues worse than what's actually going on, where, like I said, a lot of these a lot of the B plans for these decks kind of rival some of the A plans for a lot of these decks. So that's going to be our tier 2 of the list. Let's go ahead and find a home for these last 3 decks. I'm just going to get it out of the way. I think Lotus Field's like a D tier deck. I definitely have the world's smallest brain playing it because I think I'm a decent Magic player, but as soon as Lotus Field is registered in my deck, I just completely forgot how to play Magic. I think it's a deck that if you play it in paper is a lot easier to play, and then when you're playing it online, there's definitely the clock issue and whatnot, just making sure that you play faster, and there's a lot of convoluted lines and whatnot. As far as a deck for someone just to like pick up and play it, you definitely need to put in a lot of time and effort. But I think putting in a lot of time and effort doesn't really help you when you just have like a middling draw with this deck. Like a lot of these decks have very aggressive draws that, you know, just blow Lotus Field out of the water if it's not able to combo ASAP, or it doesn't have, you know, the right set of draws line up with kind of what your opponent's doing. It doesn't really want to be on the draw. I think overall it's just not necessarily putting in D tier like this. I think it is like a bad deck, you know, just from like my own personal experience playing with it and whatnot. It's definitely not the Lotus Field of, you know, yesteryears where you got to play the escape enchantment and whatnot. But you know, it's a deck that I think that for the time and effort you have to put into playing it to like be good at it, you know, if you're not already playing Lotus Field, I just wouldn't bother picking up the deck. I don't like it, and I think that's a very hard deck to learn, and it's a very hard deck to kind of like wrap your brain around what's going on. That said, it does something very powerful. When it kind of goes off and does its thing, it's a lot of fun getting to like do it the first time, but then I think kind of becomes pretty tedious, you know, once you kind of go through it and everything. But it is kind of a fun puzzle to solve. It is a fun deck to play if you like complicated for the sake of being complicated. C tier, we're going to put Blue-White Spirits and the Gruul aggro deck. So these decks, I think, you know, Spirits is very much like tempo-y in terms of like what's going on here, and I think is probably pretty decent in a lot of these matchups and stuff. When you kind of get to play at instant speed, you get to play on your opponent's turn and whatnot, you know, counter the spells that you care about, you know, leave the other ones that you don't, because you're just playing a bunch of flyers. They're going to get big and your opponent's going to have a hard time kind of dealing with them, you know, short of something like Is It Phoenix, you know, getting to play a little bit more on its turn to try to get Phoenixes back, and it's just going to be able to like run them into some of these other spirits that maybe aren't like super huge yet, to kind of like trade off resources, and they only trade off like half of a resource because Phoenix is going to come back later. But I think it's a really fun tempo deck to play. Again, when it kind of stumbles, it's not really a lot of fun to play. If your opponent is able to kind of like capitalize on the fact that you're kind of playing on their turn, where if they just stop playing spells on their turn, especially if they're, you know, Rakdos or whatever, just like, all right, well, I'm going to play discard spells, and if you decide to counter my discard spells, cool, that's like a counter that's not coming down for, you know, Vein Ripper later, which is just going to be bigger than whatever other spirits you play and whatnot, and we're just going to go from there. The Amalia deck definitely has some toolboxy creatures that can kind of disrupt what the Blue-White Spirits player has going on. And of course, if the Blue-White Spirits player ever decides to tap out or try to be aggressive and whatnot, or just slowly gets ran out of resources just from the Amalia player just playing creatures, then it gets got by, you know, just returning all those creatures back to the battlefield, proceeding to combo, and then say, all right, opponent, you have one or two cards in hand. Those two cards are going to have to deal with a lethal threat in play plus a lethal Aetherworks Reservoir or whatever, or Aetherflux Reservoir on top of my deck. So while I think Spirits, like theoretically, a lot of times where you get to play a really aggressive tempo-y strategy that you can win a lot of games and stuff, once it gets behind, it's very hard for it to catch back up. Your opponent has to stumble pretty heavily for you to kind of get there, and, you know, it's just kind of whatever. The last deck is the Gruul aggro deck. I just think there's a lot of other better aggro decks that you can play in the format that are probably a little bit more consistent. This is probably a little bit more resilient to getting board wiped and whatnot, but I think in a format where, you know, we see like Rakdos Vampires kind of is like one of the top decks, and these other two decks are at the top because they can be aggressive and, you know, can play pretty decent in like the mid game and whatnot. But I think when you have Gruul aggro in a world where, you know, Mono Green Devotion is just playing a ton of big creatures where, sure, like one of your creatures might be bigger than one of theirs, but then like they just have a whole crew of creatures that end up getting bigger, and they kind of just combo off, and they get to play like 2, 3, 4, 5 of them in a turn, where you're playing like one a turn is not very ideal. Niv Mizzet, of course, just getting to be a lot bigger than what's most creature decks have kind of going on, and of course just getting to go get Bring to Light, wipe the board, you know, and if you overextend, then you're pretty screwed. Just not really an aggro deck that I would want to see in the format. Greasefang as well is kind of a deck that we can kind of throw in here, and I don't even think Greasefang is really all that good. I think that, you know, is it underplayed? Probably, but I think with kind of what everyone else has going on, the fact that it has a combo that doesn't necessarily win the game, and being one of these 3 decks, you can either pretty easily disrupt it, race it, or just kind of straight up beat it. That it's not really super viable in the format. It's probably in like the D tier with like Lotus Field and whatnot. Probably maybe a little bit better than Lotus Field because it is a deck that is a lot easier to play. It's definitely very straightforward. But that said, it's not a deck that I would recommend people playing. I wouldn't recommend, these 3 decks plus like Greasefang. I think that if you are playing any one of these decks, that you just continue kind of playing them and you kind of like tune your sideboard, tune your main deck for, the meta that you're expecting, and then from there, just get more information and kind of learn how to navigate more difficult situations kind of like as you go forward and whatnot. And that's our tier list. That's, what we're going with. Of course, I think it's going to, there's going to be people that don't agree with it and whatnot. So, of course, if you have any comments, concerns, whatnot, please be sure to leave them down in the description down below. Just go ahead, communicate with me. I, again, take pride in, communicating with most of the people that end up being in like my comment section, asking me questions or, disagreeing with not. So definitely feel free to do that. Of course, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell so you know when future videos get posted. And we'll be looking to do something like this for the modern format, going into the RCQ season. And then that way we can kind of compare what the list looks like at the end of the season versus the beginning of the season and whatnot. And hopefully we'll be qualified for the regional championship with that too, along with hopefully once we kind of get Bloomburrow and whatnot, we're going to be diving heavily into Pioneer and testing and whatnot and trying to find a deck that we are going to play for the regional championship in Washington, D.C. later this year in October and doing some cool stuff. So if you want to check out any of that stuff or you want to be a part of it and whatnot, subscribe, ring the notification bell, all that fun, happy stuff. And yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.